They spent the equivalent of over 200 million pounds of today's money trying to grow peanuts in East Africa. They cleared forests with war surplus tanks, built an entire railway line into the wilderness, and constructed a whole new port from scratch. And after 5 years of absolute chaos, they managed to harvest almost nothing. Not because the idea was stolen or sabotaged, because nobody had actually checked if the plan could work before they started spending. That is not incompetence. That is something almost beyond belief. And the full story of the Tanganyika groundnut scheme is one of the strangest, most reckless, and most revealing failures in the entire history of the British Empire. So let us go back to 1945. The Second World War has just ended, and Britain is exhausted. The country is rationing food, including fats and oils. Margarine, cooking oil, soap, all scarce. The government, now led by Clement Attlee's Labour Party, is desperate to find a solution. Then a report lands on the desks of ministers from a man named Frank Samuel, the managing director of the United Africa Company. His proposal was bold, almost intoxicating in its simplicity. Take the vast, supposedly underused scrubland of Tanganyika, modern-day Tanzania, and plant millions of acres of groundnuts or peanuts on an industrial scale. The oil from those peanuts would solve Britain's fat shortage, feed a hungry empire, and modernize Africa all at once. It sounded like genius. The government approved the plan in record time. In just a few months, without a serious agricultural survey, without proper soil testing, without consulting local farmers who actually knew the land, they committed what would eventually amount to tens of millions of pounds to a project they had barely stress tested. The budget approved in 1947 was £36 million, an enormous sum at the time. The target was to clear and plant over 3 million acres across 3 regions of Tanganyika and 2 other territories. To do the clearing, they brought in tanks. Literally, surplus Sherman tanks and other military vehicles were stripped and modified into mechanical bulldozers, shipped across the ocean, and driven into the East African bush. The plan was to tear through the landscape at industrial speed. Instead, the machines hit a wall. The soil in large parts of Tanganyika was not the soft, manageable land they had imagined. It was rock-hard clay, baked by the sun into something closer to concrete during dry season. The vehicles broke down constantly. Spare parts were thousands of miles away. Engineers improvised with local materials, but the machines just kept failing. One officer later described watching a brand new machine snap a steel cable meant to pull down a tree root as if it were thread. Then the rains came. Or rather, they did not come. Not at the right time, not in the right amounts. The rainfall records that planners had relied on were dangerously incomplete. The region suffered unpredictable drought cycles that colonial-era meteorological stations had simply never captured properly. The groundnuts that did get planted in cracked, dry soil shriveled and died. In the first full growing season, the harvest was catastrophic. Of the planned 150,000 tons of nuts expected from the first phase alone, they gathered a few thousand. The numbers were so embarrassing that officials began adjusting targets downward every few months, hoping nobody would notice. If you are finding this story as extraordinary as it truly is, take a second right now to hit that like button and subscribe. This channel covers history's most astonishing episodes, and there is so much more to come. Back in Tanganyika, the human cost was also becoming impossible to ignore. Thousands of African workers had been recruited and brought to these remote sites. The infrastructure was improvised and often dangerous. A new port was built at Mtwara specifically to serve the scheme. A brand new railway line was laid inland from that port at vast expense. A whole town was constructed in the bush. All of this for a crop that was not growing. Workers lived in rough conditions, supply chains collapsed, food had to be flown in at points, and the grand promise of modernizing Africa through agricultural cooperation began to look like something between a colonial fantasy and a cruel joke. By 1950, the British government could no longer hide the reality. A damning parliamentary inquiry laid out the failures in exhausting detail. The land had not been properly surveyed. The rainfall had not been reliably measured. The equipment had been unsuitable and poorly maintained. The logistics had been built on assumptions rather than evidence. The entire project, one of the most expensive peacetime undertakings in British government history up to that point, had been built on almost nothing solid. The scheme was officially wound down in 1951. The final losses were staggering. Around £36 million had been spent, which in today's values represents something in the range of £1 to £2 billion, depending on the measure used. The cleared land was mostly abandoned. The new railway sat underused for decades. The port at Mtwara, built entirely to serve a scheme that failed, struggled for years to justify its existence. What remained in the landscape was mostly scar tissue, cleared brush, rusting machinery, half-finished structures slowly being reclaimed by the African wilderness. Local communities were left to piece together what had been disrupted. And in Britain, the episode quietly faded from the national conversation, buried under the noise of rebuilding a post-war country. But the Tanganyika Groundnut scheme deserves to be remembered, and not just as a punchline about British incompetence. It tells us something deeply important about how imperial powers looked at the places they claimed to govern. The land was described as empty and wasted in planning documents, yet it was home to people who had been farming and living within it for generations. The scheme assumed that industrializing a landscape meant improving it, without asking the people already there what they thought or needed. The disaster was not an accident. It was the inevitable result of building a massive plan on the foundation of assumptions, arrogance, and speed over substance. History has a way of burying its most instructive failures. This one deserved better. Now you know the full story. If you want more deep dives into the forgotten disasters, hidden scandals, and surprising turning points of history, subscribe right now and hit the notification bell. New episodes go up every week. And trust me, you do not want to miss what is coming next.